All right. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. We're going to wait just a minute or two to see if we've got anybody else slipping in at the last second here. But thanks for joining us for another Friday craft demo with the Butler Library. My name's Margaret. I'm the genealogy librarian special collections. And I have been doing embroidery for a couple of years now. So I love this as a hobby. I'm excited to share this with you guys. So this should be a fun, quick little demo of a few basic stitches. We'll just wait a minute. I'm admitting a few more people here. And yeah, if you have questions and you want to go ahead and type them in the chat while we're going, I will keep an eye on those and I will try to answer those questions as best I can. We have sort of an interesting little setup here. So I have made my phone into a little tripod so we can kind of see some stuff in action. I usually stitch kind of close to my face, so I might be working a little bit slower than normal, but this, I think this will be a fun way for us to do a little demo here. Good morning, Amber. All right. I will go ahead and ask, and if you want to answer in the chat, has anybody here done embroidery before or done cross stitch before? Anybody dabbled in the fiber arts? I got started 6 years ago. I started with cross stitch. A friend got me into that, and then I branched out into freehand embroidery like this. I still do a little bit of each, but this is my preference. I just find that you've got a little more room to kind of spread your wings, creativity, you know, in terms of creativity. And it's a little more forgiving. You're not quite as rigid in terms of counting with the cross stitch and stuff like that. If you miss a stitch or have one that's kind of wonky, it's a little easier to fix stuff. So I like embroidery. It's fun. I think it's decorative and you've got a lot of options. So it's 11 o'clock. Let's go ahead and get started. So today I am going to explain kind of the basic materials that you will need for doing some basic hand embroidery. And I'll show you how you get a project set up. And then I'm just going to show you 3 basic stitches. If you can do the first one, which is backstitch, you can do all 3 because they're the variation on the same stitch, which is really nice. But you get totally different results from each one. So that's what's fun about hand embroidery. And then I will just show you a little demo project. And like I said, jump in with questions if you have them. If you, when you're looking in the top corner of your screen in the gallery view, if you want, you can change it so that this screen here that's going to show my hands is a little bit bigger. But I will make sure I'm getting close to the camera so I can show stuff to you. So when you're doing embroidery, the basic things that you need are fabric, needles and thread, and a hoop. That's it. So similar if you're doing cross stitch. In terms of fabric, your options are pretty much the sky's the limit. I like to use quilting cotton or muslin. If it's really thin, I'll use 2 pieces, but you don't have to because that's a nice smooth, it doesn't have a lot of stretch. That means you can pick all kinds of fun patterns out. I used this floral to make this little M monogram here this morning, so you can find all kinds of fun poppy fabrics. You can stitch on colors. So here's this little outline of the state of Pennsylvania that I did on some blue, and the yellow really pops on that. You can use flannel. I've done some Christmassy stuff on flannel and some buffalo check flannel, which is really cute. And since it's a little fuzzier, it just has a different look. You can stitch on felt. I've seen people use that like really, really thin tulle gauze even to stitch stuff. So really like any fabric that you see at the fabric store, you can go for it. These little pennant flags here, these are done on felt, and then I just glued a second piece on the back to cover the stitches up. So you can see that on felt, you can get a really nice result and things are sort of 3D. And then this, again, is some cotton. It's just, I got this in the, like the clothing fabrics section. It's just got a little bit of a rib to it. Let's see if I bring that in. You can kind of see that it's got just a little bit of a texture. And that's one of my favorites that I use. And you can get this in a whole bunch of colors. I have it in blue and black and purple and red and this sort of off-white like this. So fabric, whatever you like. Cottons and linens are a little easier because they don't stretch. You probably don't want to start with like a t-shirt material that stretches a lot because it'll get distorted, but otherwise, whatever you want to use. And then thread. Most of what you'll find are the little DMC threads like this. It comes off the roll with 6 pieces of fiber. And you can split them if you want. So you can stitch with all 6. Or if I go like that, you can see, let's get my hand in focus there, that you can untwist that and pull single strands off if you want. So you can stitch with 1 thread, 2, 6. I've even, on some really big stuff, I've doubled it up and used like 10 threads with just a bigger needle. So again, there's no rules. You can also find thicker cotton like this. This doesn't come apart. It's just a thicker strand of floss. And then they make sort of fun things. Here's a spool of some metallic silver that's really sparkly. They make some satiny looking ones. I have a question. How do I decide how many strands to stitch with at a time? It totally depends on the design. So for example, this little M monogram that I have here, that's, you can see with my finger, you know, maybe 2 inches tall, and I used 4 strands at a time just because I wanted it to be a little thick. With this one, that's, I think, 3 or 4. With this piece, the little pennant flag that I did, that's all 6 because this is, you can see this is like the size of my hand. It's pretty big. So I used all 6 on the big word here, and then I think 4 on the smaller so that they were proportionate. And you can just kind of play around and get a feel for the thickness of how it looks when you're using multiple threads. You can even get really detailed. This picture that I did, so this is stitched. This is a portrait of, let me turn this, there we go, Roberto Clemente that I did a couple of years ago. And I switched it up. If I zoom in here, you can see there are some places that I did the little stripes on his face that are shading. That's a single strand. But here in some of the detail, it's 2. And then on the outline around the total outside, that was like 3. So you can change and do, you know, different thicknesses of lines to get different effects. I drew this, like I traced a portrait and then traced the picture onto the fabric itself. So it was not freehanded. And I will talk about pattern transfer in just a second here. So basically I had some tracing paper, printed out this picture, traced the outline of, you know, his facial features and stuff like that, and then transferred that onto the fabric. And then the last thing that you need are needles. You can get all different sizes. So smaller ones if you're using just a single thread versus really big, really thick ones if you're using a bunch. The main thing that you want when we're doing embroidery like this is that you want them to be sharp because we want to pierce the fabric and kind of make an opening for our threads to go through. When you're doing cross stitch, often they recommend needles that are a little more blunt on the end because you want to be careful that you're not accidentally piercing through your other stitches. But here, sharp is the way to go, makes things a little bit easier. So let's see here, let's get set up. So when you are getting, and you can certainly just completely stitch on a piece of fabric without any prep. You don't have to have a design in mind. You can just sort of draw on the fabric. let some people in. Hi there to the folks that are just joining us. And there's a few ways that you can transfer onto your fabric. When I was first starting out, I just used like a mechanical pencil and just sketched lightly on the fabric. You can get at like Joann's or Michael's or even I think Walmart, these blue marking pens like this. This is what I really like. You can see here that you can just draw right on the fabric. And this, as soon as you get this wet, it completely disappears. So these are the ones that I like, are these blue erasable markers. They make a purple one that dissolves over time just in the air, but sometimes if I get busy and I can't come back to a project, I don't like those because my design might disappear and then I have to try and redraw it on there. If you have darker fabric, so if you were using like this felt that I was showing a minute ago, they make either like a dressmaker's pencil that's kind of like a chalk that you can use to draw with, or this one is a marker pen that has like white gel ink that erases when you get it wet. So there's a whole bunch of pens and things like that that you can use to draw right on your fabric. And then there is also, I've just started using this stuff. They make basically like a dissolvable paper that you can draw on. So I just doodled on this with that erasable marker. And then you peel off the backing and you stick this sort of like webbing stuff right on your fabric and you stitch right through it, and then you soak it in water and this stuff disappears and you're left with just your stitches on the fabric. So I've used this in instances where, like if I'm using flannel and it's really thick so I can't see through it to trace, I'll use that sticky stuff and stick it right on there and then stitch right through it. It's a little finicky, you know, your needle gets a little gooey, but it's convenient and it's nice because it does just stick right on there. The stuff that dissolves is called sulky solvy. If you are in the fabric shop and go to the section where they have like all of the hook and eye closures and things like that, they have a few different versions of it. I think you can even feed it through your printer if you want to like use your inkjet printer and print a design on it. I've never tried it because my printer at home is old and grumpy and it doesn't work. So those are the kind of basic tools. And so really, if you're wanting to just get started, you can go grab a fat quarter of fabric for, you know, $2, a pack of needles, maybe one or two colors of thread. And it's like, you know, you're into this hobby for less than $10. And then you need a hoop. There's basically two kinds of hoops. There's the wood ones like this. I like these when I'm finished because they look nice. They're nice and you can use the metal hardware at the top to hang it on the wall and things like that, or you can hook ribbon through that. When I'm actually working though, I like these plastic ones that you can get at Joann's and Michael's and Walmart and everywhere like that, because they have this little ridge in the middle that sort of hooks together. And I just find that it holds your fabric a lot tighter. These are fine. You just have to retighten them a lot more with your fabric. So I prefer the plastic. So all you do is take your hoop apart and you'll lay the middle piece down, put your fabric on top of it, and then sandwich it together by snapping your other hoop on there. And then you just twist the nut at the top to tighten it. And then what I usually do is come around the edge like this and just pull that fabric tight. We want it to be nice and smooth. And ideally, I'm going to put this next to my computer mic so you can hear it for a second. But it almost, you can kind of tap it and it'll sound like a drum head. You want it to be nice and tight. And so that's how you get your hoop set up. On here, I went ahead and drew a couple of lines that I'm just going to demonstrate stitching on, and you can see that I've numbered them just so that I can show you, kind of explain, you know, come up at this number, go in at that number. So that's why I've got this drawn on here. And I'm going to do 3 different stitches today. They are all a variation on backstitch. So I've got this needle loaded up with the full 6 strands of thread that came off of here. I'm going to do nice thick lines so you guys can see. And backstitch is like the easiest #1 beginner stitch. You can use it for lettering, for drawing, for outlines, all kind of stuff. These little state of Pennsylvania designs here, the upside down is very confusing. There we go. These are just backstitch. I'll bring this one in closer so you can see. You can just get some nice little lines that vary in thickness depending on how many threads you use. And to do backstitch, what you're going to do is bring your needle up from the back when you're starting. And if we are looking at a line of stitches, if we're thinking a number from left to right, you're going to bring your needle up through the fabric at number 2. So you want to start sort of 1 stitch length into your line. We'll pull that through. And I usually stop, if I flip this over, I'll leave myself a little tail like that. If you're more comfortable tying a knot in here, go ahead and tie a knot. Let Donna into the room. Hi, Donna, thanks for joining us. I usually just leave a little tail and then I make sure that my stitches overlap on it in the back to secure it, and that's all you have to do. But when you're first starting out, just go ahead and tie a knot in the back of it. It doesn't matter, you can tie a knot. So anyway, I've come up at mark number 2, and then I'm gonna go back down in at number 1. And I will just pull that flat. So there's your first stitch. To make the next one in backstitch, I will come up at number 3. Pull that through. And you can see here, I'm pulling pretty hard on that, but that's overlapping on that little tail that I left, and it's already tight enough that I'm really like, whoops, she says, and then she pulls really hard and yanks it through. 1 second, I'll fix that. So up at 3, and then we'll go back down right next to that first stitch at number 2. I hear a little friend joining us. The next stitch will go up at 4 and down at 3. So you can just see we're just kind of making a walking little line. Up at 5. Let that go. Up at 5. Down at number 4. Up at 6. Down at 5. So you can see we have a nice little line of stitches. I was a little wiggly because I was going for speed, not accuracy, but we have a line of stitches. And then if I tilt this, you can kind of see that backstitch almost has like a little bit of like a Loch Ness Monster thing going on with little bumps, and you can see where each stitch goes in. When you're further away from the piece, you don't see that. You can see here, whoops, these are stuck together. On the Pennsylvania state outline that I did, when you're further away, you just see the outline of it. But if I get a little closer, you can see the individual stitches. And if I angle it, you can see kind of the little bumps. So that's backstitch. The next, if you want maybe a smoother line, and that's what I used for the little pennant flag. You can see if I get really close in there, it's a little bit smoother. It lays a little bit flatter. The same with that big complicated Roberto Clemente guide. This is going to be this next stitch, which is called the split back stitch. You can see it's smoother. I don't see those little Loch Ness Monster bumps. Yeah, when I put it back, I go right into the same hole. We'll do one more here if I come up real close. I come up at 7 to add one more stitch. I am going right into that same hole. If you wanted to have like a really rustic look, you could leave a little gap. It's totally up to you. That would look kind of like a little running stitch. But I am going back into the exact same hole there. Okay, so to do a split back stitch, which is going to give us a little bit of a smoother, what we're going to do is instead of going back into the hole that we were using to start our previous stitch, we're going to stab into the middle of that stitch. So we can see here, we're going to start the same way. I'm going to come up at 2 and go in at 1 to get my first stitch there. And then for my second stitch, I will come up at 3. And then instead of going down into the sort of shared hole, I'm going to come a little bit further over and go right down into the middle of that stitch. So they're going to overlap by a little bit. For my next one, I'm going to come up at 4. Tight. And then again, instead of having them just bump up and touch each other, I'm going to go kind of in between, right into the center of that stitch and pull. So you can see the line looks a little bit thicker already than the one that I stitched before in just backstitch. And it's going to be a little bit smoother. Let me get more stitches in here. Down in the middle of that previous stitch. So for anybody that's done, the folks that were saying they've done cross stitch before, you can see that I can cover a lot more ground a lot faster than when I'm doing the little X's, because you can make stitches any length that you want. When I do cross stitch, I find that I can do sort of like a square inch of fabric in about an hour. But if I'm doing bigger stitches like this, I can really like shoot all over the fabric. There's a question about how do I get a feel for how long to make my stitches? It totally depends. These that I'm doing here are a little big because I'm trying to make them viewable on screen here. I will usually do no more than 1/4 of an inch, but it completely depends on the look that you're going for. So if you sort of play around and get a feel for like some tinier stitches or some big stitches, it just changes the look of it. But yeah, I usually say no more than 1/4 of an inch just because it helps you get a little more detail in. So let me do one last stitch here on this split row. I'm going to stab into that previous stitch. If I bring that in, you can see that I'm in the middle of the one before it. Pull that down. And if I angle this up, you can see that I have the same number of stitches there, but the line closer to the camera, the one that's that split back stitch, it's a lot smoother. You don't visibly see the little bumps from where they go in because you're overlapping. So I like the split back stitch, like this one here in the front. Needle off. I like this one because you do just get that smoother line and you don't notice it as much. Whereas you do kind of see the little shadows and things on a regular back stitch. And again, if I bring the example of our first back stitch in, these little houses, again, you can kind of see the spaces between the stitches. Again, on here, you can kind of see the bumps. They look nice, I like them. But you do see the wiggle a little bit. Whereas when we're doing the split stitch, it's really smooth and you're paying more attention to the lettering. But it's all just a matter of personal preference. Okay, so those are for doing lines, doing lettering, outline work. You can draw flowers, do all kinds of stuff. But what if you want to fill in a little bit more space? You want to make thicker lines. Well, rather than just using a ton of thread, what you can do is something that's called brick stitch. This little letter M that I have here is done in brick stitch. And if I bring this in nice and close, you can see that basically brick stitch, it looks like bricks on a house. You can see how they, my needle here to point. You have rows of stitches that sort of overlap one another. This one's a little tidier, so I'll show this. And this is a way that you can basically stack up rows of backstitch, next to one another to fill in. And I love this for doing lettering, especially if it's like cursive or something like that, or like a big block M like I have here. So you can have different widths while using the same number of threads for every stitch. And when I talk about embroidery, hand embroidery being more forgiving than cross stitch, I just whipped this up this morning before our tutorial so I can have a little brick stitch example to show. And when I initially did this, I did the skinny parts with just a single row, basically just a back stitch, and then the thicker parts of the M with 5 rows in the brick stitch. But I wasn't really able to see the skinny parts on this floral fabric. They were sort of getting lost. So when I was done, I came back in and I just added a second row of stitches on all the skinny little parts to help them pop. So, you know, it's forgiving. You can go back in and add little details. You can add a stitch here or there. I even went in, if you can kind of see here, I added a couple of stitches on the stems and leaves of some of these flowers. So even if you see a cute fabric at Joann's or something that you like, and you just want to experiment by picking out a floral and filling parts of it in with some stitches, drawing on the stems, like that's a fun way just to get a feel for it. So let's do a brick stitch. Another needle here. So your brick stitch, I'm going to fill in just this little rectangle here. A brick stitch are just going to be rows of back stitch that are really close to one another. So we'll start in a little bit because we want to go back on ourselves like this. So we'll do our first row of back stitch. Again, I'm just gonna trim this off. We'll just leave a little tail. Go back in at the beginning of our line. Pull that nice and flat. Like I said, when I usually don't tie a knot. I just make sure that a stitch overlaps that little tail and it'll just kind of get woven in and hold itself in place. So we will do our line of back stitch, coming up down the line and then coming in and sharing a hole with the previous stitch. And I'm doing some pretty big stitches just so we can get a feel for it. All right, so there's our first row of back stitch done. And then to turn this into a brick stitch, we're just going to add another row right next to it. And when you think about bricks, they are offset from one another. So you don't have bricks in a house, all the seams all line up. You have them offset in the middle. So for our next row, when we do our brick stitch, I'm not going to come up directly next to our stitch, like have the holes line up. I'm going to come up in the middle. So we can see I'll come up halfway through our neighboring stitch there. And this first one I'm going to line up just because we are filling in this little rectangle. But then for the next one, you can see I'm not going to come up here where the holes line up. I'm going to come down a little bit, aligned with the center of that stitch. And you can see I've left just a little bit of room. I'm not stabbing into that one the way we did with the split stitch. I'm just right next to it. Pull my needle up and then go in and share a hole with the previous stitch. Come down here towards the center of our next stitch. Back in. Down center of the stitch next to it. Center of this last one on the left. And go share the hole with the previous stitch. So if you just picture bricks on a house, that's what we're making. And then for this last little bit of space that I have here, I'll just make a little baby stitch. So I will come up at the sort of edge of the shape that I drew. And then go down in and finish that row. If I hold that steady here, you can see that now our line's getting a little bit thicker. I'll do another row. And then what's going to happen is that every other row will sort of line up with itself. So row one, I had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stitches, all about the same length. And then this second row that I did, I have like a little baby stitch here on each end, a little half brick, and then 3, 4 long stitches in the middle. So what I'll do here to start my next row is come up even with my first row of stitches. And start stitching away. So again, I'm coming up here where I've got my needle. It's even with the top row and in the middle of this middle row. So we're just making bricks. And it really does a nice job of filling in a lot of area really quickly. And you can do, curved lines with this. You don't have to do just straight. One more stitch on here and finish this row. Okay. We zoom in there. Let that come into focus. Maybe. You can see that we've got 3 rows of stitches. They kind of look like little bricks because they're offset from one another. We made a nice thick line compared to these single rows of stitches. And I could keep going with that. I would say maybe 1 or 2 more rows would have filled in that little rectangle that I had drawn on the fabric there. And that again is how I filled in this little M. I had just drawn that freehand on the fabric. Let's rotate that so that's upright. So again, I'd initially just done one row of back stitch here. I added a second row to make it into a little brick stitch because I couldn't see it very well against the flowers. And then I have 5 rows of back stitch in the brick formation for the thicker chunks of my M there. And then I'll show you how to do an end in the back. What I like to do, I'm gonna flip my work over and show you my messy backside. When you are ready to be finished, rather than tie a knot, because you might not be able to get it really tight up against your stitches there, and then your last stitch might come a little, a little loosey-goosey like that. What you're just going to want to do is flip your work over, and you are just going to weave your needle under a few of the stitches here. So what I will do is just run my needle like that underneath a couple of stitches and pull it through. And then if I want it really secure, I might go back the other way. So that now just has the tail of my thread just woven through under a couple of stitches. It's going to keep that last stitch that I did on the front nice and tight. And then I'm good to clip it off. If you want to then also kind of tie it in a knot around something, if it'll make you feel a little more secure, go right ahead and tie a knot in it. But I find that weaving it in, weaving your ends in is sufficient to keep it on there. If you were going to maybe stitch on like a dishcloth or a tea towel, something decorative like that, maybe add a knot just to make sure when that gets used. But if it's something that's just going to be hanging on the wall or made into a pillow or something like that, weaving in your ends is totally fine. We can see our little tail here from when we started that I didn't tie a knot. I just stitched over it a couple of times, and that's nice and tight. That's not going anywhere on the front. So just weaving in the end like that is usually good to go. So those are the 3 variations on a back stitch, and you can get all kinds of fun little textural lines and writing and flowers and stuff, outlines, drawing, whatever it is. Oh, and then when you're doing a pattern, I forgot to mention this at the beginning. Obviously, these lines I had just drawn on by hand. But if you're doing something a little more complicated, so this state outline that I did, or super complicated if we're doing a face, you want to trace. So what I usually do, let's find my pattern here, is I will draw out on a piece of paper or print. If it's type, I will, just pick a fun font in like Microsoft Word or something like that and make it the size I want and print it out. And then I will put that underneath my fabric to trace it on. If it's really thick lines and you have a thinner fabric, let me take this out of the hoop for 1 second here. If you have a real thin, like quilting cotton, you can even on camera kind of see that M right through that fabric. If it's something that's a little bit thicker, like this cotton that I got from like the clothing section, because I like the texture on it, you can't really see that through. I mean, I can if I squint. I don't know how well you can see it on the camera. But what you can do is just hold this up to a window and you'll be able to trace. I do have a little light tablet. So you can see if we are looking at that M there. I'm just going to trace it with my erasable marker. For years and years and years, just held my stuff up to the window and traced it that way. It's easy. The sun is free, so it doesn't cost anything to use that. But often I do this in the evening while I'm watching TV, when we're binging something on Netflix. So I did go purchase a light tablet for about 25 bucks on Amazon that just runs off of a USB cord, and that lets you, you know, any time of day. So it can be 10 o'clock at night on a Saturday, and I can trace a pattern because I don't have to wait for there to be daylight at the window, but probably 3 years into the hobby before I invested in that. So certainly just tracing at the window is going to be just fine. Does anybody else have any questions? What I'm going to do is just put this fresh little M here with the little heart into a hoop and stitch on it for a second, just so you can see it in action. And then if you've got any questions, you let me know. So we sandwich our fabric here. So there's a question, when you want to frame something in a wooden hoop, how do you secure the fabric on the back so it doesn't slip? Great question. There's a couple of things that you can do. So say I was going to finish this, and I do see another question. I'll get to that in a second. Say this was a wooden hoop, and I had this nice and centered in here, and I was done. What you can do, you can flip your piece over and cut your fabric pretty short, maybe 1/4 inch from the edge, and then just use some hot glue and glue the edge of your fabric down inside the hoop itself, inside the wooden hoop. The other thing that you can do, and that's my personal preference, is you can, so you can do the same thing, trim your extra fabric off. And then you can take a needle and thread and do like a running stitch of thread through there. Let me get a single strand and I will demonstrate with this hoop. Basically, you'll be keeping it tight with your thread instead of, oops, there we go. So what I'll do, I'm just going to, and I would use sewing thread. I wouldn't use my embroidery floss for it, but just for the sake of demonstrating. So here I've pulled off one strand. And what I do, it takes a little bit more work, but I like the way it looks. I will just pretend I've cut the corners off so I don't have all this excess fabric. I will do a running stitch around the outside. So I will just weave the needle in and out, and I'll tie a knot in it first. But I will just weave that in and out all the way around, because then when you pull that tight, it's going to make that fabric bunch up, and that'll make it lay flat in the back. Let me see. But I will, I'll pull that tight in the back so that it just sort of lays tight. And then I will either glue or stitch a piece of felt over the back. I like it because when you glue the fabric down, if you just glue it in like this, you can still see the stitches. You could always put something over top of it afterward. But I just glue or sew a piece of felt on the back. The reason I like that is that just in case something were to happen to this piece, say a kid touched it with cheese, Cheeto fingers, or it gets a little stretched out and loose. If it's glued in, like it's stuck there. But if it's just sewn with the back on, I could flip the little stitches here, take this off, take Roberto out of his hoop, wash him, and put him back together. So it's just a matter of personal preference. I sew mine in, and I think it's because I'm the genealogy, the archive person, that I'm like, okay, no glues, I'll just stitch it in, but go ahead and hot glue it. It doesn't matter. But yeah, I just cover the stitches up with a piece of felt in the back. And then the other question, you had a pattern that says 3 strands wrapped twice. I don't normally see patterns say that, but I think what they mean, let me unthread this needle and grab this one. I think what they're referring to in that instance, thanks, Jana. So here's my like 6 strands right off of my shank of floss. I would take 3 strands out. And when I'm cutting this, I usually don't cut it any longer than maybe like 18 inches because it can be prone to getting tangled and you might kind of get a knot. And it drives me crazy when I've got to pick a knot out. But I would pull 3 strands out. 2, 3. So you can see now I've got 3 individual strands instead of that bundle of 6. And then I would thread all 3 of them onto my needle, the ends of these. So for the 3 strands wrapped twice, what you would do is normally, if you thread a needle, you pull it through just a little bit. So you've got this short little tail here, and then your long working thread. The wrapped twice, you want to pull so that your needle is basically in the very center, and you've got 2 even tails here. I will do that sometimes if, well, there's a couple reasons that I would do that. Because you can see here when I've got the tails all the same length, if I come in here, let's get all this out of the way, and start stitching, if I was, the way I was demonstrating, if I just had my little short tail and then the long working thread, what you would see on the top of the fabric would just be stitches that are made up of 3 strands. Whereas with the wrapped, when you bring it down and they're even, I'll just stitch on here. Because you're bringing double the thread through, that little stitch that I have there, that's actually 6 strands of thread that's showing. But what's nice is that you don't have all the bulk at the end of the needle. So when I'm stitching, you know, and I just have my little thread, you've technically got everything doubled up at the end. So when you're bringing the eye of the needle through with your needle threaded traditionally with 3 strands, you're pulling, you know, you're forcing 6 strands of thread through with the eye of the needle and then having, you know, the 3 on your little tail. So what this does when you've got it folded is it just gets rid of a lot of the bulk. In instances where I've done really thick, really bulky, like if I go back to this example on the felt, when I was doing this with these stitches are made up of 6 strands, I did it folded over like this so that when I made each stitch, I wasn't trying to, every time I brought my needle through that felt, trying to initially pull 12 strands of thread through to be able to get that stitch. Does that make sense? So that's why when if they do it wrapped like that, it's just to reduce the amount of bulk that's at the eye of the needle coming through the fabric. You have to do wrap twice for something like chain stitch. No, you don't have to. It makes it a little easier, but you don't need to. I mean, part of the problem is with when you have it folded over like that, is you can see that like my needle won't come off the thread because it's caught on there. So if you're just starting out and let's say you want to pick a stitch out, when I was stitching the way I showed here where I kept a little bit of a tail, if I didn't like something, I could always take my needle off so it was just loose in my hand and then use it to pick these stitches out and redo them. Whereas here, when I've got the threads doubled over and I'm sort of stuck on here, I don't have that ability to undo it. So it has its pluses and minuses. It's definitely helpful if you're using a lot of threads to get a really thick line, because you'll save yourself a lot of sort of hand stress trying not to yank that many threads through. But it's totally your preference. Okay, does anybody else have any more questions? If not, we might wrap it up because we've been keeping you for about 45 minutes. But I appreciate everybody joining us. All right, well, everybody have a good weekend. Happy stitching if you decide to take the leap into this, either from your cross stitch hobby or if it's totally new to you. Bye, guys.